the 14th of December 1944. In the waters of Subic Bay, off the western coast of Luzon, Philippines, the Oryoku Maru cut through the waves slowly, heading north toward Taiwan. On deck, Japanese guards stood watch with rifles ready. But beneath the surface, in the ship's hold, a living hell was unfolding. In the pitch-black darkness, over 800 American POWs were crammed into a sealed cargo hold with no ventilation. The air thinned with every passing hour. Gasping breaths, groans, and screams echoed through the night like sounds from another world. The stench of animal waste never cleaned out, mixed with the smell of blood, sweat, and despair. Some men went mad, screaming, biting their comrades. Those desperate enough to climb toward the hatch for air were gunned down by Japanese guards on the spot. No food, no water, and no possible way out. The Oryoku Maru continued its slow journey across the sea, as if nothing was wrong. But beneath its rusting steel shell was a drifting prison where death didn't strike swiftly, but crept in, tightening its grip hour by hour, and the worst had yet to begin. In truth, this horror for American soldiers didn't begin with the Oryoku Maru. It had been smoldering for years in another place, on land, under the same enemy's guns. In April 1942, after months of desperate resistance under harsh and dwindling conditions, American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula were forced to surrender to the Japanese. Around 60,000 prisoners were marched into what became known as the Bataan Death March. Nearly 100 kilometers under scorching sun, with no water, no food, and no mercy. Thousands collapsed and died along the way from exhaustion, starvation, or were beaten to death by guards for falling behind. Those who survived, or more accurately, had not yet died, were sent to prison camps like Cabanatuan and Bilibid Prison in Manila. There, they endured months and even years of forced labor, disease, hunger, and brutal physical abuse. Some were transferred to labor camps on other islands, but most remained in the Philippines until the tide of war shifted. By late 1944, the Allies had begun a fierce counter-offensive in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur made good on his promise and returned to the Philippines, launching an amphibious landing at Leyte Gulf in October. Forced onto the defensive, the Japanese military began evacuating Allied POWs from the Philippines, both to prevent their liberation and to exploit them as forced labor in camps across Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. However, Japan did not have any specialized ships for transporting prisoners of war. Instead, thousands of men were crammed into cargo vessels, military transports, or freight ships with no Red Cross markings, no food or water, and no trace of humanity. In the cramped ship holds, the living were forced to lie beside the dead, and these journeys often stretched on for weeks or even months. Allied prisoners referred to them as hell ships. According to historical records, during World War II, more than 126,000 prisoners were transported on at least 134 such voyages, organized by the Japanese military. Over 21,000 Americans were killed or wounded, mostly as a result of friendly fire from American submarines and aircraft, which had no way of knowing that enemy ships were carrying Allied prisoners. Among that long list of infamous voyages, the Oryoku Maru stands out as one of the most terrifying. What happened next would be more brutal than anything the prisoners had endured before. On the 13th of December 1944, just one day before the nightmare began, the sky over Manila was thick with the dust of war. At the city's main harbor, Japanese forces began herding Allied prisoners onto a transport vessel named Oryoku Maru. At the time, the name still sounded strangely harmless. The ship had once been a mid-sized passenger liner operated by a Japanese commercial company. In peacetime, it carried civilians between East Asian ports, but war had turned it into a military vessel in disguise. On its decks were Japanese soldiers, commanding officers, and nearly 1,900 civilians, including women and children, all awaiting evacuation. From a distance, no one would have guessed that this ship was about to become the site of a war crime. As for the more than 1,000, 600 Allied prisoners on the dock, mostly Americans, along with British, Dutch, Canadian, and Australian troops. They were not called by name or boarded in any order. They were shoved forward at bayonet point, screamed at in a language they could not understand, and forced into the ship's dark cargo holds that felt more like mass graves than compartments. These areas had previously been used to carry livestock or damp cargo and sat just a few meters above the waterline. The Japanese had installed rough wooden shelves to pack more people in. A hold meant to contain no more than 250 people tightly lying down now held over 800. There was no airflow. The temperature inside rose to nearly 50 degrees Celsius. It became a giant, sealed human furnace. The stench of sweat, blood, urine, uncleaned animal waste, and human panic blended into a suffocating haze that defied description. Not a single drop of water was given. Not a crumb of food was lowered into the hold. Within hours, thirst began to claim lives. Many prisoners tried to drink their own urine in a desperate attempt to cling to life. Some began to lose their minds. There were screams, there were sobs, there were groans that sounded more like dying animals than men. That night, as the ship cleared Manila Bay and the waters gently rocked beneath it, hell truly began to stir. The air was vanishing. Breaths turned to gasps, and even those were swallowed by the mass of bodies suffocating in darkness. Many of the men had survived the infamous Bataan Death March and believed they had endured the worst. But that first night aboard the Oryoku Maru made them reconsider. An American prisoner named John M. Jacobs would later recall, "We had no air to breathe. Some started to cut and bite each other's arms and legs just to suck blood. People went mad. Anyone who tried to climb the stairs for air was shot on the spot." That night, about 30 men either suffocated or were trampled to death. It was no longer a prison. It was a floating graveyard, lacking only tombstones. The next morning, December 14, the ship continued toward Subic Bay off the western coast of Luzon, from where it would turn north toward Taiwan. But for the prisoners, directions and time had lost all meaning. Every sense was crushed beneath the weight of heat, thirst, and hunger. Up on deck, the Oryoku Maru bore no Red Cross flag, no markings to signal it carried prisoners. To the American pilots scanning the seas from above, it was simply an enemy transport vessel drifting through hostile waters. That very morning, aircraft launched from the USS Hornet took flight on a mission to intercept Japanese shipping, and by noon on December 14, as the Oryoku Maru neared the naval base at Olongapo, sirens blared and the roar of engines filled the sky. Deep below, in the ship's dark hold, no one could have imagined that American bombs were falling and that the very vessel carrying them was the target. The first explosion tore through the air. No warning, no sirens, only massive plumes of water rising like towers and the hull convulsing as if crushed by an invisible vice. In the pitch-black hold, panic erupted like a second bomb. Bodies fell upon one another, screams shredded through the chaos. Some men were hurled into the steel walls, their skulls striking with a sickening thud before they collapsed into the choking clouds of gunpowder and hot metal. John Jacobs, an American POW who survived, later recalled, "We were tossed around like animals shaken by their own master. There was nothing to hold on to, no light, only the blasts, the blood, and bodies beginning to pile up. Fragments of bombs and rusted steel tore through the hull, flying like invisible blades and leaving gaping wounds on flesh. In the hold, prisoners groped for scraps of cloth or torn shirts to dress each other's injuries in the dark, without medicine, water, or even a single voice of comfort. In one corner of the pitch-black hold, Army Chaplain Father Duffy knelt with hands clasped tight, whispering through the chaos, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The small prayer was drowned out by the thunder of war, but for those who heard it, it said everything. No one above knew their comrades were trapped below. On deck, the Japanese troops fought back with everything left. Anti-aircraft guns screamed. With every new wave of fire, gunners fell dead by their guns, but replacements came running only to fall moments later. Blood covered the deck and trickled through the floorboards into the holds below. All through December 14, 17 waves of air attacks rained down on the Oryoku Maru. Nearly all the escort ships had been sunk or had fled, and still, the ship stuffed with despairing souls refused to sink. Not because it was strong, but because fate wasn't finished with it yet. Night came. The bombing paused, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with death. No more screams, only groans, delirious muttering, and weeping too weak to make a sound. In the hold, heat and the scent of corpses grew unbearable. Some slipped into unconsciousness. Above them, Japanese soldiers began evacuating civilians. Women, children, and senior officers were taken off first. The prisoners were left behind, as if they didn't exist. At dawn on December 15, American aircraft returned. But this time, Oryoku Maru had no more defenses. No guns, no guards, just a lifeless hulk adrift, leaning hard to one side. Then something unexpected. A hatch opened. A voice barked, "You will be taken ashore, wounded first." Roughly 50 men rushed up first, some pretending to be injured just for a chance to live. But as soon as they reached the deck, American planes returned. A line of bullets swept across the ship. Prisoners dove for cover on the scorching metal. Amid the chaos, John Jacobs saw his only chance. He kicked off his shoes, ripped off his shirt, and threw himself into the sea, his body plunging into the waves in an act of sheer survival. Planes shrieked overhead, but he was lucky. He swam hard, past flames and wreckage, through screams and oil-slicked water. Some clung to barrels, others to stalks of bananas. Some sank, never to rise again. Jacobs and 2 others managed to swim ashore, collapsing exhausted onto the rocky coast. But it wasn't the shore of freedom. A squad of Japanese soldiers lay in wait, and they weren't taking prisoners. Right before Jacobs' eyes, a fellow POW was shot through the chest and dropped dead without a sound. Jacobs rolled back into the water, hid behind a rock, and held his breath, praying to survive the burst of gunfire. When the air finally fell silent, only the waves remained, slapping against the scorched hull of Oryoku Maru. The ship tilted, burning, and slowly sank beneath the waves, taking with it hundreds of men who never got to say their final words. Around 270 prisoners died over those 2 days, most from suffocation in the holds or during the chaos of escape. When the Japanese rounded up the survivors, only about 1,290 remained from the original 1,619. It was a staggering price to pay for a journey that had only just begun. What lay ahead would be colder, longer, and even more brutal. Hell did not end with the sinking of Oryoku Maru. It merely changed form. The surviving prisoners were gathered onto an abandoned tennis court in Olongapo, exposed under the blistering tropical sun. Some 1,300 men were packed together on cracked concrete with no shade, no toilets, and no roof. Above them, the sun burned white-hot. Beneath them were blood, urine, and the dying. On the first day, not a drop of water or a scrap of food was given. The wounded lay moaning under the open sky, limbs twisted in agony, while those still able to move searched for leaves or strips of cloth to bind their comrades' wounds. There were no medics, no bandages, and no mercy. Only vacant stares and broken breathing. By the second day, the Japanese began handing out what they called rations. Each man received 5 small spoonfuls of raw rice and a trickle of water from a leaking spout near the court. That was all they had for 5 days. Some prisoners chewed the rice like gravel. Others were driven mad by thirst. When a light rain briefly fell, desperate men lowered their heads to drink from filthy puddles. Some even gulped seawater when driven near the shore. They collapsed soon after, convulsing and dying from salt poisoning. The severely wounded faced a crueler fate. A Japanese officer named Junsaburo Toshino stepped forward and spoke to the crowd. He claimed that those most injured would be sent back to Bilibid prison in Manila for treatment. 15 men were chosen. Their bodies were drenched in blood, their limbs broken, some already blind. They were loaded onto a truck, some of the others clapped, thinking those men would finally receive care. The truth only came to light after the war. At the 1946 War Crimes Tribunal, a witness testified that the 15 prisoners never arrived at Bilibid. They were taken to a deserted cemetery, forced to kneel with blindfolds, then one by one beheaded. Their bodies were hastily buried in a shallow pit. It was an execution in all but name. To those holding the swords, human life was nothing more than discarded cargo, no more valuable than a rag. On Christmas Eve of 1944, while the rest of the world was lighting candles, hanging ornaments, and singing carols, 1,278 surviving prisoners were herded onto a train bound for San Fernando in La Union Province, northern Luzon. There were no passenger cars, only sealed freight cars, hot as furnaces, no ventilation, no space to sit. With every jolt, dozens of men fell on top of each other like rotting logs. Some collapsed, lying unconscious on the metal floor, mouths open, gasping for air like stranded fish. That night, they were locked inside a dark warehouse near the port, without light or food. Strangely, some still whispered, "Maybe this time it's the ship to Japan. Maybe the death march is finally ending." But they didn't know that an even worse ship than the Oryoku Maru was already waiting. On December 27, the order came. All prisoners were to board the Oryoku Maru and Brazil Maru, preparing to leave the Philippines. But they did not board like humans. They were forced to jump from the dock into landing boats more than 7 meters below. Those who hesitated were jabbed in the back with bayonets. Those who slipped broke bones before even leaving land. The ship holds were no longer for cargo, but more like animal pens, still coated in feces, urine, and the thick stench rising from rotting wooden floors. No cleaning had been done. The prisoners entered and once again breathed air no human should be forced to inhale. They lay atop one another, parched, burning with fever, as the road through hell carried them farther into the sea. The ship left Luzon, drifting across the South China Sea for nearly a week. No food. No water, no word of what awaited. Only on the 1st of January 1945, upon arriving at the port of Takao, modern-day Kaohsiung, Taiwan, were the prisoners finally given their first meal since departing Manila, a few mouldy green biscuits and a handful of cold rice. Too late for many. At least 21 prisoners died on the ship from hunger, thirst, and malaria. Their bodies were thrown into the sea by Japanese guards without any ceremony, name, or grave. When they arrived in Takao, all the surviving prisoners were transferred to the Oryoku Maru, where fate was already waiting. Even though the ship had docked, no one received care and no one was allowed ashore. They were simply left waiting. On the morning of the 9th of January 1945, the sky turned grey. The alarm sounded, and just minutes later, Takao Harbor was bombed in a surprise air raid by Allied aircraft. In that chaos, the Oryoku Maru was struck. A bomb pierced the deck and exploded directly inside the hold where hundreds of prisoners were huddled together. The floor collapsed, throwing dozens of men from a height of more than 10 meters into the lower hull. Jacobs, who survived, recalled, "I stood frozen. Around 300 men, all Americans, were buried beneath twisted steel beams. Their bodies were stacked in 3 layers. No one screamed anymore. There were only choking sounds, blood, and hands reaching out through the smoke. About 350 prisoners died that morning. Tragically, once again, the Allied pilots did not know they were attacking their own men who were still waiting to be rescued. There were no visible markings on the ship, no warnings, only war, and its devastating consequences. Roughly 600 survivors were then moved to the Brazil Maru, the final floating prison. On the 14th of January 1945, the Brazil Maru left Takao, heading toward Japan. At this point, no one was truly alive in the full sense. Many were just skin and bones, lying in high fever, suffering from diarrhea, or barely conscious. The winter cold at sea killed faster than hunger. Every day, more prisoners died quietly, without cries or farewells. When the ship docked at Moji Port in Kyushu on January 29, Japanese doctors asked the prisoner physician to complete 1,001 death certificates. From December 13 to January 31, in just over 7 weeks, more than 1,000 prisoners had died. Not from bombs or bullets, but from hunger, thirst, disease, abandonment, and the stripping away of their humanity. When Oryoku Maru arrived in Moji at the end of January 1945, fewer than 500 prisoners were able to step off the ship. They dragged their feet like shadows. Some had to be carried on stretchers, others leaned on each other just to stay upright. Their faces were hollow, their limbs were only skin and bone, and their bodies looked like they had just been pulled back from the brink of death. From the original 1,619 prisoners, only about 425 survived to set foot on Japanese soil. These survivors were divided into small groups and sent to labor camps across Kyushu, and even to Korea and Manchuria. In the eyes of their guards, they were merely laborers, human tools to be used as long as they could still draw breath. They survived, but not whole. Each carried more than just physical wounds. Lingering fevers, screams in the night, vacant stares fixed on nothingness. 161 more men collapsed and died during the first month on Japanese soil. From Oryoku Maru to the end of the war, only 264 men lived to see freedom again, just 1/6 of all, who had stepped aboard the ship in Manila. In August 1945, when World War II came to an end, the last surviving prisoners were finally liberated. They returned home in tears, clinging to their families as if embracing the pieces of life that had been torn away. On their shoulders weighed the crushing memory of those months at sea, in darkness, among corpses and despair. For months, news of them was shrouded in uncertainty. It was not until March 1945 that the United States began receiving word from the Red Cross and scattered intelligence reports that the Oryoku Maru had sunk. Line by line, testimony and documents were pieced together, slowly forming a full picture of one of the darkest chapters in the Pacific War. In 1946, during war crimes tribunals in Tokyo and Manila, many Japanese officers were brought to justice. They were held accountable for their brutal treatment of prisoners, including starvation, abuse, forced labor, and the execution of wounded men. Among the evidence, the execution of 15 prisoners at the tennis court in Olongapo stood out as a chilling example of cruelty that defied all standards of humanity. Despite the extreme physical and emotional suffering, the survivors of Oryoku Maru chose not to remain silent. They spoke up. They wrote memoirs, testified in court, appeared in schools, conferences, and museums, not to spread hatred, but to preserve the truth. Their courage helped the world learn about the hell ships, vessels that drifted silently across the ocean, carrying not only prisoners, but also the burden of hidden crimes. Among names like Oryoku Maru and Oryoku Maru, Oryoku Maru remains the most vivid symbol. Its journey lasted only 2 days, but its echoes still reverberate through generations. Cruise of Death. That is the name given to the journey not for poetic flair, but because it was chillingly accurate. The story of the American prisoners on Oryoku Maru is not only one of tragedy, but also of extraordinary endurance, unbroken dignity, and the will to remember what is right amid the storm of history. They emerged from the darkness not for revenge, but to protect something greater, humanity, and the lessons of the past. They told their story so the world would understand that peace is not a given. If forgotten, war may return in even more terrifying forms. From those suffocating ship holds of the past, amid gunpowder, smoke, and dying cries, the survivors emerged into the light. They carried no medals, only one thing, the truth. And it is that truth which has helped them, and all of us. Never lose sight of why humanity must choose the path of peace.